and welcome to the Filmmakers Guide to the Galaxy. We're on episode 5, I think. And,
that's right, yep.
Yeah, and we have here David Mullen ASC. Hello, David.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we have a few people watching us on YouTube, hopefully. But we just thought we'd get going by. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Filmmakers Guide. We thought we'd get going by just asking you a couple of questions, such as what have you been watching in this lockdown?
I've been watching mostly old movies. Some of it is just some Blu-rays I bought over the years. I just never got around to watching. So I just watched Robin and Marion, the David Watkin shot film. I've been watching some old black and white films. Someone gave me a box collection of the Criterion Janus films from the 60s, 50s.
Right.
So I've been watching a lot of classics. Like I for the first time saw Wages of Fear, which I hadn't seen before. I watched Mr. Hulot's Holiday. I watched an old film noir, In a Lonely Place. So it's just basically old movies and TV shows and stuff. I have this Blu-ray collection of Space 1999 now from the 70s, and I've been going through that too. So I'm a big science fiction
time to get a load of DVDs you bought that you haven't got around to seeing, right?
Yes.
So, okay, David, well, you've done a lot of feature films and indie movies over the years, and a bunch of short films earlier as well. Just wondering, is that where you sort of picked up developing your style of work, and how did that evolve as you went on to bigger projects?
Well, it's hard to say how my style evolved. I was making my own films for almost 10 years in Super 8, from middle of high school through my mid-20s, and that's when I went off to film school. And by then, I'd been shooting for so long that when I got to Cal Arts graduate film school, I got typed as a cinematographer and asked to shoot everyone else's thesis project. So I started shooting Cal Arts thesis films and studying cinematography for a long time, and just basically learned by reading books and watching movies. That was my main education. I was a big fan of Vittorio Storaro, so I was sort of copying him and Alan Davia and Conrad Hall and those people. A lot of British cinematographers too. I really got into Jeffrey Unsworth when I was a high school student with Superman and Cabaret, and then David Watkin, John Alcott, Freddie Young. So I just watched a lot of movies in college, basically, and that sort of informed my particular style, and that just sort of evolved since then. I don't particularly strive to have a style. It's more my personal taste mixed with whatever I decide is right for the project.
Fair enough, yeah.
Sure.
And I guess working with like the directors and the team.
Yeah.
And you, I think I saw in another interview you did the other day that you said your kind of learning ground was just doing like a lot of feature films, and then you eventually moved into TV shows. Or streaming shows.
Yeah, I went straight from film school into low-budget feature indie work as a DP, so I never worked as a camera assistant or anything like that.
Sure.
So I was doing all these non-union, very low-budget films for about a decade, and then budgets just kept improving, and then at some point I moved into television off and on in the 2000s, just about the time that the indie world was on the decline and television was on the rise, basically, in terms of budgets.
Yeah.
It was a brief, I was very lucky. I got out of film school in 91, just sort of at the tail end of a wave of straight-to-video features that were being made. Like they had decent budgets.
Sure.
They were being sold internationally. So there are these producers that I shot a number of these films for in the 90s. And then I started to move out of those sort of straight-to-video genre films into films that I would hopefully get into a film festival, kind of art house stuff. And that was just about the time the studios started forming independent divisions like Sony Pictures Classics and
right.
Paramount and they all had an indie wing basically, but with better budgets, and they all tend to be union films because they were studio films. So in the 2000s, I started doing those films, which was nice. But then they all started to close shop by the mid 2000s, or about the 2008, 2009, the recession, and that's about the time that television sort of became more, called me more often, basically. So I moved primarily to television after about 2010.
Sure, I've noticed a lot of DPs. I don't know if it's the same in America, but in the UK especially, they do, like you said, they do those indie films that are, $1 million sort of budget, and then they do say 10, 15, 20 of those, and then they realise, like I think in last year, like there was a huge recession in terms of the amount of budget put into feature films, and a lot of DPs are now going into TV because you've got $1 million to 10 million an episode, just for an hour. So it's definitely better budgets, as you said. I think a lot more people are definitely going into that. Would you recommend people to sort of focus more on the series stuff, or do you think doing features is still a really good learning ground?
I think features is always a good learning ground because you're more in control of the overall look and process from start to finish. Television, it's a very mixed bag. You might not be the DP that started the show. The look can change over time. You may not always get prep on every episode. So
Sure.
I think features, especially these indie films where you don't have the budget, but you do have the time with the director to really design a whole look from start to finish and then see it through, I think is a good, solid basis in terms of learning your craft as a DP, from concept to finishing, basically. I think with television, it just, some shows you don't get a lot of work, time to help design or stylize or figure out the look, and you're not always involved in the post end either because you're still shooting while they're posting, or it's the opposite, you've moved on to another job while they're posting. So there can be less control in television, but it really varies show to show.
I mean,
when I'm doing Marvellous Mrs Maisel, I shoot most of the episodes and I'm involved in the color correction step. So on the other hand, because I shoot most of the episode, there's a number of episodes where I don't have much of a prep. I literally go 3 episodes in a row without prepping the later ones. So having to rely on my experience with the director and knowing the style of the show to kind of get through it. But it's just sort of, it really varies show to show.
Sure. I mean, I was going to sort of say this for later, but I think you kind of brought it up. But do you prefer shooting on films where you get to, be the DP from the beginning, from the prep beginning right all the way through to the end, or do you like the fact that you get to do an episode here, an episode there? What's your and then tell a story over a longer period of time? What's your kind of preference?
Well, there's no preference. Ideally I do both. I do a series and then go off and do a feature in between, and then go to a series and do a feature. I would love to be able to time it out like that so I can just alternate every year, but it doesn't work out that way. Yeah, the trouble with independent films is that they only go when the money is ready.
Yeah,
so they may call you a year in advance and then keep delaying their start date up to the point where you're now booked on something else. So it's very hard to have that window open to do a feature. I would love to do that more often.
So are you still interested in doing smaller indie feature films as well then?
Yeah, I'm still interested in that. It just depends on the director and the material. I mean, some material is more compelling than others. So
sure. I mean, you did a film called The Love Witch, is that right?
Yes.
And that was, was that kind of an indie film in a way?
Oh yes. Yeah, definitely.
And you imitated the 1960s sort of color, the vivid colors, and they're very striking, as well as the lighting and that style from that era. How did you sort of go about doing that especially on a limited budget? I was just wondering how you approached that and how you kind of make it come to fruition, really.
Yeah, because the replication is was near enough perfect, wasn't it? It's great.
Yeah, the Love Witch was my first non-union film in like a decade. You know, I had not gone back to non-union, but this was with a director I've known for a long time, Anna Biller, and I had gone to Cal Arts with her. She was a few years behind me, so just as I was graduating, she was coming in. So we met my last year at Cal Arts, and she discovered that we both had a fascination with old Technicolor movies and old color films in general from the 30s, 40s, 50s. So we talked a lot about that lighting style, and we did a short film together back in 1993, I think it was, in that style, in 16 millimeter. And so when she did a feature film called Viva about 10 years ago, and then when she got the money for Love Witch, she called me up. So I hadn't worked with her in a while, but
yeah.
Again, she was concerned because she had been talking to other cinematographers, and they were sort of giving her kind of lip service to that style of filmmaking, but they weren't like 100% committed to doing it. And I knew from working with her before that she would want to just be all out exactly the way these old films were shot in terms of lighting. She had
not even mimicking it, just she
was
going
well
for that.
Researched herself. She had read John Alton's book, Painting with Light. She had practically memorized it. So we talked a lot about the particulars of lighting, and she wanted exactly that style. So my job, and the same with the short film when I did with her earlier, was to stop thinking like me in the year 2015 or when we shot the film, but pretending I was someone back in the 40s or 50s, someone who had trained in the 30s, is now still shooting into the 60s, and had been doing this hard light style his whole career, and tried to adopt the aesthetic values of a DP back then, who maybe is working on a tight budget and doesn't have the biggest lights in the world, but is still trying to emulate like the highest end studio product, like Hitchcock.
So you just put yourself in the shoes of the people then, basically, and just kind of went with it. And I think I remember seeing a post somewhere that you obviously it's a lot in the color grade to kind of help match. But
not as much as you think, because we did a photochemical post.
Okay.
So I overexposed the negative and printed it down, but that was pretty much it in terms of creating the look, other than with lighting,
So yeah, he's literally keeping that all the way through, all the way to the end of the post as well. Amazing.
Was that
all the effects had to be done in camera. There's all these drug trippy sequences are done with filters and kaleidoscope lenses, and I use glass shots and things, all sorts of stuff to do in camera effects, because there was no post effects work done. The only post work we did was all the fades and dissolves had to be done digitally because there's no optical printers anymore.
Yeah.
So we had, for those shots, we had to get them scanned and then created digitally and then rescanned back to film. Same with the title sequence. I wanted the titles to be done in optical printers so they would feel like a movie where it suddenly gets grainier and there's titles. And but they had to do those digitally too, just because there's no more optical printer.
And what film stock and camera were you shooting on, and lenses for that to help sort of get it in that era?
Well, it was. I wouldn't say the technology itself was much in the air, other than the fact we shot film, because we shot modern vision 200 speed film that I rated at 100 speed. So she was very adamant about me using a lot of light. She wanted to walk on the set and if it wasn't blindingly bright, she would be worried that things were lit. So using slow film and then really pounding everyone with a lot of light is sort of part of the aesthetic of the film. I could have simulated it with higher speed film in smaller units, but she felt that it would even sort of affect the performances and the way the sets look, whether I was using a 10K versus a 2K or a tweenie. So I just had to think a really strong old-fashioned Fresnel lights, and it was tremendously hot on the sets because of that.
Yeah.
So I was rating 200 speed at 100, which made it pretty finer grain than 35 films back then would have looked. She didn't particularly want a grainy look, even though we're shooting film. She wanted to be very rich and saturated, but not grainy, because technically to match 35 millimeter of the 60s, I would have like push the film to stop or something, but she didn't want to do that. Plus, we didn't really have the budget to push, all the footage for the entire length of the shooting. So we stuck with the fine grain film stock, overexposed negative, printed down. I use Zeiss super speeds, which are, from the 70s.
Yep.
I wouldn't say though that they added a period look. I ended up using quite a bit of diffusion, sort of netting mainly, and some classic soft filters. I found those super speeds actually quite sharp.
Yeah, they are sharp. Yeah, definitely.
And the funny thing is they suddenly drop off the cliff right around 2:8 split. So I had a few low light scenes where I had to shoot wide open, and that's where they suddenly got a lot softer. Like, we shot into magic hour a few times, and I just had to go wide open. And so again, it was like an older film that you see old movies, and you could tell when they got into low light situations because the lenses just didn't handle that very well. So we were sort of mimicking that through using these lenses. But in general, I was shooting always at a 2.8, and the Zeiss lenses are pretty sharp at a 2.8. Yeah. So in retrospect, I wonder if I would have been better off shooting everything on like Cooke S4s, which would have given me that Cooke look, which is a little more classic, and I would have had more focal length choices than the super speeds gave me, because I had to mix a few standard speeds in there.
Okay.
She didn't want to do wide angle lenses, so we're mostly shot on a 35 or a 25, but occasionally I used like a 28, I think it was, standard speed.
Were you on the Mark IIs or the Mark IIIs for the most of the set?
I think the Mark IIIs.
Okay, yeah. I've used the Mark IIs more often than the. They're not as common as the Mark IIIs and the Mark IIs, but yeah, they are nice. Yeah,
they're not, that period looking. It's from the 70s. Considering they're from the 70s.
Yeah, they just give a little bit.
If you shoot them at 2.8 or higher, they're crisp, sharp, saturated. So. But she didn't want to use older lenses. Like I talked about trying to dig up Cooke Pancros and stuff, and she's very concerned about saturation. She wanted as much saturation out of the costuming and props and that Technicolor feeling. And she was worried that lenses have faded, where their optics have faded or anything.
Cooks do tend to be a little yellow as well, don't they?
Yeah, and she didn't want any yellowness. She didn't even like warm lighting. She wanted the lighting to be generally white.
Yeah.
So the colors would be as much. The pop as much as possible. So, the lenses didn't necessarily lend a period look. I think the netting is what really gave it that look. And that was partly inspired by what Hitchcock did in Marnie. If you look at, Vertigo, he used fog filters for a number of dream sequences in Vertigo. But by the time they did Marnie, they made this decision to shoot it all through nets. And some nets in the film are quite heavy, like silk stocking kind of stuff, and so I was sort of copying that approach by using a light netting through the whole film.
Yeah, and you just put that on the back of the denier stockings or something on the back of the lens?
No, I kept it on front because I needed to be able to pull them in and out easily. I have a netting that's lighter than any kind of pantyhose. It's actually a black tulle that comes from like a bridal veil shop. It's actually more durable than nets too, so it doesn't stretch and tear very easily.
Okay.
But it's lighter in strength, so I have that as my base net filter most of the time. The only thing I don't like about it is it has a simple crosshatch weave, so you get kind of a X or star pattern rather than those kind of striations of a Dior or something.
Sure.
And then I had a Dior and a Fogel net on a frame stretched for close-ups when I wanted to go heavier, basically. So that was generally what I did. The only trouble I had with the nets in front of the lens was when I got to my day exterior work. I hadn't thought this through, and I'd used this. The Zeiss Super Speeds are fairly small lenses, so indoors with the net in front of the lens, it was fine. But outdoors, we had a whole Renaissance Fair sequence, and I decided to use a Cooke zoom for that because we had so many shots to get quickly. And this Cooke zoom, the front element is so large that once you put the net on the frame, even though the 4x5 frame fills the lens, just physically having that big a glass element in front with the net in front, and even with the matte box, I was getting a little more veiling and contrast loss from the netting than I was indoors with the Zeiss lenses. So that's where rear nets would have made more sense, or sticking to glass filters, or putting something like that, or sticking to the primes. But
all right. Well, I mean, it's amazing. It's an amazing result that you got with that. I think we should probably move on to the Marvellous Mrs Maisel, which you've done. I mean, well, you've done most of the episodes on that, haven't you?
I did the pilot. I did half the first season, and then 2/3 of the second and third season, basically.
Right. Okay. Was that the beginning 2/3 or the later 2/3?
No, basically the first season was 8 episodes, and I shot 4 of them, including the pilot. Mm-hmm. Then the second season I shot 7 out of 10, and the third season I shot 6 out of 8. So
right, yeah. So in terms of, I mean, what I've found from watching the show, I don't know if I can't remember because it was so long ago now, but the first season, if this happened in the first season, but certainly when I just watched the third season recently, there's a lot of continual camera movement, which I'm guessing is just to help accentuate the quickly spoken, fast sort of New York heavy dialogue scenes. How did that sort of come about between you and the director, like with the concept, and how were you achieving that? I know you used gimbals and Steadicams, but and more technocrane stuff in the third season that I noticed anyway. But with the constant movement, how did you approach that? Like what sort of tools?
Well, the sort of complex oneer is something that Amy Sherman Palladino has done in her previous shows, like Gilmore Girls and Bunheads and the Gilmore Girls Netflix movie she did. So I knew going in that was her style. A director who had worked with her told me the same things. That's like, think Orson Welles when you go in there. I said, okay. Big crane moves, things like that. She loves these kind of long shots, and the fast dialogue has clearly been part of her repertoire since the beginning. So when I interviewed for it, they warned me that things would move quickly, and she told me that the pilot was all shot on location. There was no sets at all, and she had warned me right off the bat that there's this big scene where Midge comes home to tell her parents that Joel has left her. And she says it's going to be a oneer shot where she's going to follow her into the living room. She's going to wake up Dad. They're going to chase into the den. They're going to go from the den into the foyer, and they're going to go from the foyer back into the living room. So it'll be more or less, 3 rooms, fast, going through doorways, head, behind, all that sort of thing.
You're putting your hair out.
There's coverage in that sequence once they stop and talk in the living room. But otherwise, the rest, it's all a oneer. And on location, which meant I had to figure out how to light it, not see the lights as we moved from room to room, which meant a lot of light mats in the ceiling, basically. And that's sort of been the approach since then, is mainly light mats tucked tight into the ceiling.
Is that the same on season 3, for her old apartment and the parents' apartment? Is that all on location, is it? What was interesting when we did the pilot is we had this old apartment in the Upper West Side. It's actually the same apartment, the Upper West Side, that you see in Inside Llewyn Davis. It's so when he goes to return the cat to the couple, that's the same apartment we've shot the pilot in. It was available for renting, basically, on the Riverside Drive. The thing is that building, all the apartments have the same footprint, more or less. So her apartment, and then 2 floors above her was her parents' apartment location. And the only difference was that her apartment, the dining room area, had been sawed off and turned into a separate apartment. And so when you go into the parents' apartment, there's a bigger living room space because it incorporates a dining room area. Mm-hmm. But on her apartment, you come in the foyer and you immediately go through a tiny door to get in the living room. But to your left would normally be the dining room area, but that's part of the next door's apartment in the real location. So when we went to series, the production designer, Bill Groom, recreated that apartment. And because it was the same design as the parents' apartment, and in the series she would move from her apartment, she'd lose it basically and move in with her parents. We shot all of her apartment scenes first, and then we basically we took the set and converted it into her parents' apartment set. Became the parents' apartment set for the next 2 seasons. Yeah.
And now the parents have lost that apartment, and now she's at the end of this third season, she's reacquired her old apartment, so they reconverted it back into her apartment for that one scene that we had in the third season. So that's a set. But when the parents move out to live with their relatives out in Forest Hills in Queens, that's a real house in Queens that we filmed in.
Yeah, but for you saying about the light mats. I'm a big advocate of light mats, just because like you said, you can put them anywhere, and you don't get that height, protruding down. But so even if it was a set, you'd still stick with the light mats, were you? Just because of the ease and the softness and stuff. Bill Groom likes sets with solid ceilings or fairly immobile ceilings. So I like that too, because personally, I feel when sets are missing their ceiling, that there's a lot of contrast that goes up, because the ceiling acts like to bounce or reflect light back into the room. Yeah. So as soon as you eliminate it, someone turns on a table lamp in the corner of the room, it doesn't really go anywhere. It just shoots up into the soundstage ceiling and disappears. So the sets need a lot more light, and they get a lot more contrasty when there's no ceiling. So I always put in something, even if there's a set with no ceiling, I always stretch muslin or ultra bounce over the top of the set to contain the light essentially within the room. Yeah, so in that case, our sets, they can remove sections of the ceiling when I absolutely need to, but for the most part, and which we do to run power, like we have a lot of holes drilled in our ceiling set now to run the power to the light mats. Yeah. But otherwise, we just drill the light mats into the ceiling. Is a pretty fast way to work. And the sets all have chandeliers and sconces and table lamps and things too that I can light from. And when you're using obviously the light mats for the as top lights or top three quarters, I noticed. Well, you do a lot of 360s and move through rooms and things like that. Or you're starting a techno crane and then it'll come off or whatever. So you do all these complicated moves, but do you then decide, most often, change it to a side key or something when you then go in when they stop moving, go to an over the shoulder?
No, generally, if it's established in the wide that she's soft top lit, then I'll keep that for we don't really do close up, so I can't change the lighting too much anyway. We go from a knees up to a waist up at the tightest, so the lighting can't jump too radically. Yeah. Occasionally the blocking works out that they're not lit from overhead, but they're lit from the window or the lamp direction. So then I can side light them softer. Okay. That in those cases. So often, if they're in the den and the living room's off camera and I can justify the light spilling in from the living room from the side, I'll light it like that and then just soften it further on close-ups. Yeah. We have a Light Mat 8, which is pretty nice. It's like a 4x4 size, so it's a pretty soft key light. And often what I'll do is just, if I can relight a close-up, I'll soften it further just by T-boning like a 6x or an 8x light grid cloth on a C-stand in front of it, just to sort of make it softer. Yeah. But that's about all I can get away with, basically. Sometimes I've had to handhold lights, where
they're moving around.
The top light's not quite in the right space, and I want to side light them, but the camera backs up and would see the light, so I'll have to have an electrician, walk in and then dive around a corner or hide behind a dining room table or something like that in the last minute before the camera sees them.
So basically, just like a walk and talk sort of boom with an LED in a gem board or something, kind of thing, just overhead. Yeah.
Yeah, I've done that too. Yeah. I don't do a lot of paper and lantern kind of stuff though. The light mats tend to be easier to control than a lantern, but sometimes I'll do a round light as well. Yeah. I constantly we have a lot of scenes at the dining room table, which has a chandelier over the center with a lot of little bulbs in it, and me and the other cinematographers have constantly changed our minds on how to light those scenes. Like, one episode will be 2 china balls on each side of the chandelier because it's a long table. Yeah. Other times it'll be a light mat on each side of the chandelier, and other times it'll be a Source 4 Lico bounced in the ceiling next to the chandelier. We keep trying different approaches to find the best way to approach those scenes.
It's nice to know that even the top DPs are always experimenting, and you never try the same thing twice, and you always try to see what's best. And It's really fascinating to know the ins and outs of how you're lighting that show, because it is really beautifully lit.
In terms of the movie thing, we started that in the middle of the first season just for one scene. We had a scene at the Copacabana that starts out with a technocrane move that basically pulls back from the drummer on a stage and then over the heads of the dance floor.
I think I saw the behind the scenes thing of this.
Yeah, we disconnected the movie off the technocrane at that point and then walked it through the tables of the place and then out the kitchen doors and into the kitchen and meet Midge and Susie coming up the staircase. So that was our first kind of big technocrane movie disconnect move like that.
Was the director then hooked and was
Yeah.
like, I want it all like that now?
Every shot.
Although she would prefer it if we could do it like with a step off with a Steadicam, because she still likes dealing with a Steadicam more. I think because
Really?
the trouble with movies is that they're a two-man operating job. So, you have our main operator is now at the wheels, and then often it's his brother, Larry McConkey. Jim McConkey's our main operator, and his brother, Larry McConkey, who's a very experienced Steadicam operator for Scorsese and people. He would come in and operate the movie. So the two of them would be on headsets talking together. But it's not quite the same as a director dealing directly with one operator, like on a Steadicam move, where she can sort of finesse exactly where the camera should be at each moment or something. So there's still more control over the shot with a Steadicam, but there's just things you can't do with a Steadicam. It's harder to fly over the heads of dancers at head level and not have the Steadicam, let's say, in low mode, but then when you step off, you're stuck in low mode. So,
although, have you tried the AR rig or the ARRI Trinity or anything like that? Have you guys thought about using like that, something like that? If she prefers Steadicam in a way, just because of the single operator, because obviously with the AR rig you can go from high to low and things like that, and it's not an issue.
No, we haven't tried that. I think if Larry and Jim thought that would work, they would try it, but we mostly stuck with the Movi and the Steadicam. We have the Movi, we call it the Wonder Stick. Larry designed a kind of boom pole for the Movi.
Yeah, I think I saw an image of that. Yeah. So
it allows him to sort of move it up and down quickly and around.
So is that on the arm of the Steadicam?
No, he uses what they call a armor man rig. It's to support the weight. Yeah. So he's just holding it with his own arms with the armor man rig.
Yeah. And then he's got that post, and I think I've seen that behind the scenes where it goes between the telephone dials, switching all the different numbers, and it goes between them all. And that's with that little post, is it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was again one of those sequences where Amy wanted the camera move very quickly. She said it had to keep up with Midge as she pushes her chair back and forth around the room, and so she was concerned the Steadicam wouldn't be fast enough. So we had to see a rehearsal basically to get a sense of how fast the chair would fly across the room.
Oh shit! I think we lost them for some reason there. I think my Skype just crashed. Let me just call them back. Hold on one tick. There we go. I don't know what happened there. I'm probably overpowering my computer, I think. Bear with us. These things happen. There's always something, isn't there? See if David picks up.
Is currently unavailable. Please leave a message after.
Let me try calling James back. Sorry about this, folks. Just bear with us. Hi, James. Hi, how are you? You're back. Sorry about that. I think my computer decided to freak out and crash. I'm just going to try and add David back into the call. Yes, crashed under the sheer weight of knowledge. Exactly, Phil. Yeah.
Too much
info.
Hello?
Hi, you're back. Yeah, sorry about that. We'll have to swap the things around. Nope, not that way around. There we go. Nope, doesn't matter. We'll leave it like that. I think my computer crashed there. Sorry, David.
Yeah.
So you need to make the screen, sort out the screen, Simon. I think at the moment.
I've done that. We're all good.
Okay, fine.
So just to quickly move on to the sort of the era, James, did you want to just sort of touch on that, asking David that?
Asking. Sorry, let me just make sure the screen is correct. It is, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, yeah, it's all looking. So my one is delayed a little bit. So
okay, there we go.
Yeah, I was just asking Paul. We sort of had that slight problem. Was what did you do differently to achieve the look of the era on the series? And like, was you helped, I guess, by the look of the costumes and like the art department? Was there anything in particular you how you approached it?
We looked at a lot of the period, production design of the time, the advertisements, movies, historical reference photos, but when they interviewed me, they said they did not want a period look in terms of any kind of faded sepia tone golden look. They wanted it to be vibrant, lively, energetic, fresh, So the period look really comes from the production design and the costuming. Even the lighting, I tend to think it's naturalistic in terms of it's source motivated. It just tends to be flattering and a little more frontal at times in order for the costumes and everything to look, a little more poppy. But that's part of the 50s aesthetic, and I'd sort of already studied that when I did The Love Witch, except that The Love Witch copies the actual lighting styles of the time. But that aesthetic of the 50s color design, the kind of, I call it industrial optimism, where everything after the war is going to be more colorful and better and prettier. And so offices are extremely well lit. You see these old movies and reference photos where back then they started building these giant ceilings of fluorescent lights, like you see in movies like Billy Wilder's The Apartment, on the solid wall of fluorescent ceiling lights. So that kind of soft top lit, polished look is just sort of part of that modernist aesthetic, in the design of office buildings and spaces. So, and even in the pilot, we had different sort of periods because New York isn't all one period. He works on Park Avenue among these kind of Mears Van der Rohe international style office buildings. But then they go to Greenwich Village, which is, brownstones and old brick storefronts, and they live in the Upper West Side in a pre-war apartment. So there's different eras within New York, even though it's set in 59, 60, and we respect those kind of different worlds she moves in, from the Upper West Side to the Midtown to the Lower East Side kind of aesthetics in New York. But generally I was thinking again of this kind of 50s aesthetics in terms of this kind of optimistic, positive view of things. So, and there's a certain romance to the film the show that I try to bring out, romantic moments. It's just trying to enhance certain scenes so that they feel emotionally correct for the scene, in terms of the tone of it.
Yeah, I noticed you weren't always using, obviously, just the light panels and things. There was often large sources through windows and a bit of haze and things like that. Just like you said, give a bit of romance.
People smoked a lot back then, so I was able, we use smoke in all the club scenes, anywhere that it's logical to see haze in the air. Don't haze in general, just because again it would wash out the colors a little too much. But I have added haze for a few non-smoking scenes. We had like a.
I think you're allowed to do that.
We had like a church scene in. There's a scene where Rose goes and finds her daughter-in-law in this empty room at the Catskills that's been turned into a synagogue, but it's just basically an empty community room. And it's kind of a log cabin-y space out in the woods. But I put a little bit of haze in there just to make it feel more church-like in a way, she's all alone. And it gave it an interesting feeling to that sequence, this big empty room. It felt like a Japanese movie, actually, because everyone's sitting on the floor in this polished wooden floor with these columns and windows everywhere. So occasionally I can sneak in haze, but otherwise, and like but bar scenes, obviously, I get to use it all the time.
Sure. And you were shooting on Primos, is that right? Panavision Primos?
Again, we don't use period lenses. I talked about it with the other DP, Eric Mornier, in the first season, because after the pilot was done on the Primos, he was wondering if we wanted to look into the older lenses at Panavision. And I felt that one is that we just sort of established the look in the pilot with the Primos, but also the way she moves the camera. The trouble with older lenses is that you often get weird flares from them, and we will do a very complex move and then land on someone and then hold it for like a minute of dialogue. And if by chance that moment we land, there's a weird edge flare from a window or a table lamp, I don't want to have to go to tell her that we'll have to redo that take because of that weird flare or something. So even the Primos, which are fairly sharp and low flaring, have an interesting flare characteristic that I run into. If you point them into a bare light bulb or something, you get this big reddish ring that almost takes up 2/3 of the image. It's not a little one, it's a big, soft reddish ring. And occasionally that gets a little distracting if you have a scene at a makeup mirror or something with lots of light bulbs. I had some issues with those in the runway sequence at the end of the 3rd season where Midge and Susie get fired, when they meet Shai Baldwin's manager. We created the runway out in the parking lot of our studio.
All right.
Nice.
Visual effects added the plane in. We just had the ramp to the doorway area, and then I just covered the parking lot. We wetted down the parking lot, and I covered it with.
I thought that looked really nice. Even if it was a car park, it looked really nice.
Well, we're trying to figure out how we were going to do this plane sequence on our budget, because we couldn't get back to Floyd Bennett Field, and we couldn't get a period plane. So, and we were worried about the backgrounds, if we tried to do it in the city. And basically, Amy said, look, I'd love this to look like Casablanca, just very minimal, just a dark airfield. You don't really have a background, just fog everywhere. Yeah. And just lights on the actors. And so by taking that approach, I didn't try to light the background at all. I just simply put a few kind of street light effect. We had these Nook lights strung across the tarmac for the plane area, and then the far background I had these battery powered LED kind of work lights from Home Depot, from a hardware store, just sort of scattered in the background to create little points of light, and that created the effect of a airfield basically. Yeah. But occasionally the Nook lights are very sharp, little quartz bulbs in them, and I pan around and suddenly the Primo lens would just give me this big ring in the middle of the shot for a moment. So I'd have to tell the operator, when you're steady camming around, just try not to land with that light centered, because then you get a perfect ring around the actors there. So
yeah. And with the James brought up the era of that show. So in terms of diffusion and things like that. I think I saw you mention before that you used the Hollywood Black Magics. Is that right?
Yeah, that's not so much for a period look. It's just more for, the classic, let's take the digital look off, these modern lenses and cameras. Yeah.
I think they're the same ones they use on Game of Thrones. They just take that edge off, but they keep the highlights very close to the source, don't they? For blooming and stuff.
Most of Game of Thrones is shot clean, but I know Rob McLaughlin liked to use those sort of filters on his episodes, and so some people would be using them in and out on Game of Thrones. Okay. But there's a lot of clean stuff too on that show. The Amy and Dan had used the Hollywood Black Magics on the Netflix Gilmore Girls movie, and they liked that look, and I had been using them ever since. I did United States of Terror back in 2010, so I've been using them for almost a decade now. So we tested other filters. They didn't particularly want a filtered look. They just wanted the actors to be a little more flattered, and it adds a little romantic glow to sequences. I just have to modulate the intensity, because when we get into club scenes, there's a lot of smoke in the air. The same amount of diffusion can look too heavy, so I'll have to back off from our 1/4 strength to an 1/8 strength. The nice thing about Hollywood Black Magics is they're actually a combination filter. They're made up of a 1/8 black frost filter and then degrees of HD Classic Soft on top of that. So I can carry just an 1/8 black frost if I want to get rid of the softening of the HD Classic Soft.
Right. Yeah, because I find even I find them, like, compared to say like a Black Pro Mist or something, I find them quite. I know they're a different brand, but I find them quite quite strong, even on the lower end. You know, like you have to go to say like an eighth on the Hollywood would be almost like a quarter on the Black Pro Mist. If you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's the same. I learned that too, because we do mix up a few other filters. I occasionally have to go to a Tiffin Black Diffusion effects filter, which is, I always make fun of it a little bit because it's the most boring diffusion filter ever made, because it doesn't look like you put a diffusion filter on. It just, you put it on and it softens the image, but there's no glowing lights, there's no contrast loss.
That's what you're after, just something to show that there is something there.
Yeah, I usually want a little bit of romance from the little halation and stuff, but occasionally I have too many lights in the frame, and the Hollywood Black Magic creates some distracting halation around the head that your eye goes to, and I don't want them staring at, the eye. So I'll go to the Black Diffusion effects filter in those scenes, like the switchboard scenes. It's all lit with just those bare light bulbs under each operator. And I first start out with the Hollywood Black Magic. You got this blurry ring around every light bulb, and it's pretty, but you start noticing the light bulbs in this shot, and I didn't want your eye to notice these light bulbs so much, so I went to the Black Diffusion effects filter. But occasionally I have gone to just a straight Pro Mist or Black Frost when I want more of a hazy glow and less diffusion, because it's it just depends on if I'm trying to create like a misty, overcast day feeling, let's say, and I think, maybe just more of a heavy Pro Mist will create that feeling of a foggy day better.
Yeah, it gives you that haze feel, doesn't it? Yeah.
So I'll occasionally switch out the filters, but again, I find I have to go to the heavier frost to match the softening of the Hollywood Black Magic. So it really is like a half Black Frost is equal to the quarter Hollywood Black Magic, or even the eighth, in terms of, not so much in terms of the halation, which is going to be heavier actually, but in terms of sharpened detail. Like if you look at the wrinkles around the eyes, or the fat, the weave of a coat, that's where you start looking for fine details and how much the diffusion filter is softening that. That's where the Pro Mist type filters don't really blur those kind of details. So, as much as it doesn't have those little dimples in the glass the way the classic softs and the HD classic softs do. So I vary filters by whether I want more of a mist haze versus a softening, or the combination. And it depends on the space. I pulled out an old fog filter for a Magic Hour fog sequence and when Susie has been taken up by two gangsters and is being sort of marched out to their shack on a pier at twilight, and it was all kind of foggy, blue fog everywhere. I basically used an eighth fog filter on that shot, just because I wanted to enhance the feeling of the fog and the mist rolling in and all that stuff. So
nice. Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that, because I think I used to have a set of Black Pro Mists, and then also a set of the Hollywoods, and I would just use, one or the other kind of, if for a music video you want that whole kind of haze and kind of feel, that you're quite separated from them. But then, for fashion or drama, I'd often use the Hollywoods, just like you said. They just get rid of that slight detail, and with newer modern lenses, I think they're quite a nice. They complement them well, I think, if you use the weaker end anyway.
Yeah, Tiffin, that's a Schneider product. Tiffin has a similar filter called the Black Satins.
Oh, okay.
They don't quite have the blurring. When you look at a light bulb with a Hollywood Black Magic, what you see is two halations. You get the misty halation of the Black Frost, and then you get this blurry halation of the dimples in the HD Classic Soft. When you look at a Black Satin filter, which I think is a combination of a Tiffin Black Diffusion effects, which again is, like I said, the boring diffusion that doesn't have artifacts. Yeah. They combine it with, I think, a glimmer glass base.
Okay.
So the glimmer glass is creating a little bit of a glow.
Yeah.
And then the degrees of diffusion effects is creating the softening. But because diffusion effects doesn't have the artifacts of an HD classic soft, you're not getting that double glow effect. You're only getting the glow from the glimmer glass, I think. So it's similar, but different also. It's an interesting filter.
I'll have to check that out, because it's very hard for me sometimes to see the difference between different filters, and I think you have to shoot a lot with maybe a set to then notice, or at least in the field, because if you're in a test room or something, you just sometimes don't notice these things.
Yeah, it's all, you have to kind of point it into a candle flame or a tiny point of light to see how they particularly interact, or actually just look at the filter under a microscope or something, and you'll see how they're designed. Years ago, I had a great chat with Ira Tiffin, who designed both the diffusion effects and the soft effects filter, and all those filters he designed for Tiffin. And he told me all about the history of like Mitchell diffusions and all these filters, and how inherently, a diffusion filter is meant to throw part of the image out of focus and leave sharp rays to come through, which is what a net does. The weaving in a net diffracts the light and bends it and causes that detail to go out of focus. But the clear areas in the net allow light to go straight through and create sharp. And diffusion is not an out-of-focus image. It's the layering of an in-focus image and an out-of-focus image together, and that's what creates diffusion. So net does that, and classic soft, all the Mitchells, they all have something in the glass that distorts the light rays. Either it's a dimple, or with a Mitchell, it's like a series of etched, I think they're kind of trapezoid shapes or a pattern etched in the glass. When he created the soft effects, he used the kind of kidney-shaped dimple in the soft effects, and then he took that further when he did the black diffusion effects filter, and he made the dimpling much more smaller and hard to see, so that you didn't get the halation from the dimpling. And he added a pattern of black dots over the filter to restore the contrast, so that you wouldn't have the milkiness of any diffusion. So that's why the black diffusion is such a good filter for just softening the image, but it has no filter look. So that's why I was talking about it's a little bit boring. They actually later pulled the dots off the filter and sold it as digital diffusion effects early 2000s, because what was happening is that dot pattern was coming into focus on 2/3 inch HD cameras. So they took off the dot pattern and basically called it digital diffusion rather than black diffusion. And they did the same thing. Schneider did the same thing with the classic softs. The classic soft dimples were coming into focus on 2/3 inch cameras, so they made them smaller and they called it HD classic soft. So, but when they made the Hollywood Black Magic, when they added the 8th black frost to it, they did the same thing with the classic softs. They combined an 8th black frost with the classic softs, and they called it classic soft blacks.
Right.
When they did it with the HD classic soft, they called them Hollywood Black Magics. They just came up with a whole new name.
Right.
So
just trying to get more money.
Yeah. I've got a question here. Favorite lenses. Do you have a default preference when you're setting up a look for a show, or does it come from the director?
Well, it always comes out of discussions with the director and myself, and also what the locations are going to be like and the style of the show, and and are you going to be mixing them with zoom lenses and all these sort of issues. How low a light level do you need T1.4 lenses, or are you okay with T2? So there's all these logistical and practical issues that you have to sort of counterbalance. That's why the flare issue is an issue with me. Like, I love lens flares, but I need to be able to control them, too. Yeah. So it's always like, that's why sometimes I carry like the 15-40 Ingenue zoom, not because I need a zoom, but occasionally I do want a lens with some flares in it. When I point into a spotlight on stage and I want a lot of rings and things, I have to go to a zoom lens to get those sort of all those elements to show up. So, you want to be able to control when those things happen. So it all comes out of discussions, but I tend to use a little bit of filtration. So I tend to lean towards the more contrasty lenses to compensate for that. If I was going clean, but when it's soft, then I'd look at the lower contrast lenses and then shoot clean. So it just depends on your approach to the show.
I found that as well myself. Just, you know, if you go with older lenses like Bancros or something, they're kind of soft anyway, so there's no point really adding a filter. And then if you're going to have very modern lenses like, you know, master primes, ultra primes, or, you know, whatever, I too, you know, I think a filter just to take that edge off and give it a little bit more character is nice. Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I like master primes, and I did one series with the Leica Summilux Cs because they seemed like master primes, but lighter. You know, they were T14s, but not as big and heavy, which I thought would be useful for Steadicam and things. So I did discover they flare a little bit more than master primes. It's they're all really good lenses, but I had an office scene with a bright window in it, and our 21 mil a Leica lens, something broke in it, and the rental house was out of them, so they sent me a 21 mil master prime, and when I put it on the camera, suddenly this glow from the window that was sort of reflected, you know, creating a counter glare in the opposite corner of the lens, this just disappeared. As soon as I put the 21 master prime on, suddenly that ghost image of the window just sort of dropped away. So master primes are definitely, you know, great for avoiding flare.
They're very clean, very clean.
But it just varies. I'd like to try more lenses. You know, I like anamorphic too. So I know one of your questions you had for me was about anamorphic.
It was, yeah. Well, it was sort of moving on to WestWorld. I think I know you've done one or two. Was it 2 episodes or 1 episode?
I'm credited as 1 episode in season 2, but I shot portions of everyone on WestWorld works on each other's episodes because they shoot so piecemeal. It's not like they could shoot a whole episode, move on to the next episode. Right. Literally, like, this set won't be built until sometime of episode 7.
Okay, yeah.
Or this actor is only available in the first half of this, you know, season, but we have to shoot all the scenes through all the episodes. So you end up, you know, suddenly being told you've got to pick up all the control room sequences, all that round.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
You know, like 10 scenes in that room from 10 episosions, and you have to go pick them up.
Yeah.
So
because it's also
match
they edit
each other a lot.
They edit it very, you know. I don't know if I can't remember if it's more so in just the first series, but it's so backwards and forwards. You're kind of like, I don't know if this is the past, the future, the present.
Oh yeah,
and obviously I can imagine that's a bit of a nightmare when you're reading it and you're, you know, when they're all trying to break down who's shooting what when. I
was very confused by season 2. I came in the last month of season 1 to do pickups, and I did a lot of inserts and pickup scenes in the control room and things. But the second season, I came in and did 5 months of that sort of work, and I started getting a lot more scenes to shoot. And then the unit was going to move out to Colorado to do like 2 weeks in Colorado, and that's when they offered me to shoot episode 7 back in LA. So while the main unit was in Colorado, I was in LA with shooting episode 7, basically.
Sure.
And the odd thing, as we mentioned, is the anamorphic in episode 7.
Was it the only episode with anamorphic, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was very confusing when I started shooting. I came in like 2 months into the second season, and I was looking at dailies, and I would see some dailies would be 235, and other dailies would be 16:9.
Right.
And I started noticing anamorphic shots in the dailies. Then I would see spherical. And there was a lot of sequences in the lab sets and the corridors and the control room, and some sequences would be all flashing red emergency lights, and other sequences would be darker. And I had a hard time getting a straight answer. I basically was taking lots of notes on because I was trying to pick up sequences. I say, "Oh, you got to do this control room scene," and I go, "Well, I just looked at dailies, and this one scene had like work lights set up, but this scene had flashing emergency lights set up. And when did those lights go off? And when did they come on? And when did they switch to these lights?" And it was also shot out of order that I was worried that I was going to screw up and have, have the wrong lighting going on.
Yeah.
So I had to, I sort of started to learn that there was these 2 storylines and these, 2 timelines basically going on. One was 2 weeks after the other. And somewhere in those 2 timelines, the lighting changed in the WestWorld lab sets. It turns out when I finally shot episode 7, that was the episode where the lighting changed. Literally, in my episode, they plant a bomb in their control room, and just when there's a sequence in the main control room I have where there's a big firefight, and first the military people are in there on the second timeline, and they're typing away at their laptop, and someone says, "I've got the systems back online," and then the lighting comes back to normal from the flashing reds, and I go, okay, that's the moment the lighting gets restored. And then like 2 scenes later, someone blows up their main computer, and all the lights go down and come up again. So my episode is sort of the transition in terms of the lighting between the first timeline and the second timeline. But I didn't know that until I was shooting my episode. It started to make sense to me, but I was matching very carefully what had been shot up till then, trying to make it sense. But when I arrived in early September, around episode 3, they asked me to shoot Anthony Hopkins' last scene, the last day. He was only available for the first 2 months of shooting. So they had to shoot all the scenes, even though they show up later. They had to shoot all the scenes earlier. So they only shot his stuff. Like if there was a sequence of him and Bernard or him, they would just shoot anything with Anthony Hopkins in it. And they would save all the coverage, reverse angles, cutaways to later, because they had to get so many pieces with him.
Really? So someone else down the line has to match.
I'll just be his close-up, or something.
I mean,
or a wide shot with him in it. And I'd say, you need the reverse angle still on Bernard, so I got to match that. And then you need this and you need that. So, but the one thing they hadn't shot with him at all was that street scene where he walks out in the street in Sweetwater and he snaps his fingers and the whole town
anamorphic scene, yeah.
And they hadn't shot any of that scene. They'd shot some of the interior scene in the saloon where Bernard talks to them at the piano. And actually, I shot a pickup of him at the piano, but they had already shot the main scene with him with the piano, but not Bernard's side of it. So, knowing that was my first day when I got onto the show.
So it wasn't just you shooting anamorphics, then it was other people shooting that same scene at other points.
They basically, I got the impression was the anamorphic was just this kind of sequence with Bernard. It was kind of virtual reality when he plugs himself into the mainframe, basically in his mind or something. That's where he meets Anthony Hopkins, is in this kind of virtual world, and that's why it's an anamorphic.
I did think it looked a lot nicer, to be honest, but that's just because I'm a fan of anamorphic. I thought it looked a lot more
Western.
It looked Western.
Setting.
Yeah, it looked
cool.
It looked like a Western. But
it was kind of fun because I had. So the funny thing is, I show up and they said, you got this one scene to shoot with Anthony Hopkins. I don't know where it goes. It's just, he's going to be out in the street talking, and you got to use these old Tadeo anamorphic lenses combined with some Cook anamorphics to fill in the gaps. And the reason they hadn't shot it was because that summer had been averaging like 120 degrees every day out there in Santa Clarita, and it was just too hot to shoot a full day of standing outside in that street with him. And even in September, they were worried it was going to be too warm.
Right.
Should we try to silk the whole street or anything like that? But it was just too big a stretch to silk with, hundreds of extras. And so we shot it in September, and I shot that sequence. And then they asked me to shoot a sequence where Bernard arrives to Sweetwater before he meets Anthony Hopkins, he gets off the train and we walk through the town, and every shot is a recreation of the original pilot where Teddy got off the train and walks through town. So we pass the same guy hammering at the mill, and we pass the kids playing with the drunk and the scorpion, and we pass Dolores coming out of a store and running into Teddy and all that stuff. So I had to look at the pilot and recreate them in anamorphic now, which was kind of fun.
So I mean, just butting in there, sorry, but it sounds crazy. Obviously, I was going to ask. One of our questions was going to be, how do you step in and do an episode? When you say episode 7, and there's say 10 episodes, for example, and there's people before you, there's people after you, but you're literally doing, like you said, someone does a wide and a close up of one actor, and then you come along 2 weeks later and do a close up of the other actor.
Yeah,
that's just madness. I don't know how do you go about matching the lighting? I mean, you can't. Are there gaffers who are like constantly making notes, or someone other than you watching the
notes? You can talk to the main gaffer, Len Levine, if he shot the original stuff. But that a lot of Bernard stuff was a whole another unit, different DP. They hired, I think his name was Teo Mandiasi. I think his name was. He came in and just shot the Anthony Hopkins scenes. So he was his own unit kind of thing. So I would call him up and ask him, questions about this footage. Why is the light coming from here? Is the room lights on? Are they turned off? Or, it was, he wasn't always necessarily clear either, because the whole scene hadn't been written necessarily, parts of the scene that they're in or things. So, there's a lot of guesswork involved, but it's just mainly about analyzing the footage,
Yeah.
And
I mean, I think that shows experience, because if I watch something and then try and recreate it, even if I got the same sort of truck of tools, I think everyone's different and everyone's gonna. But to go from, say, a shot of Anthony Hopkins and then you do the reverse, I mean, and it's got to match.
And make it consistent, isn't it? Yeah, make it all consistent.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but it's I did a lot of pickup shots for the first season, so I would look at all the camera reports, so that if the people couldn't remember, I could always look at the camera system notes and see what filters and focal length lenses they use. That's where I started seeing the odd Tadeo.
Right.
I was like, Tadeo, it's like, random, then I'd go find someone and have them explain to me where they got these Tadeo lenses and things like that. So it was a lot of fun. But after I shot that sequence in the street, later when they gave me episode 7, it turns out that scene was for episode 7. So I actually shot a scene for my own episode, which was nice, because often you're shooting scenes for other people's episodes. But I had the most anamorphic stuff, I think, in my episode practically in the end. But like I said, all the angles on Anthony Hopkins was shot by someone else, Teo, other than one pickup in that street scene, basically. It was fun using the cooks too. I had one shot though where it's hard shooting film, because you're not seeing the image, you just got a video tap with Steadicam shots. And the director of episode 6 had the scene where Bernard walks into the town, and then episode 7 is where he then talks to Ford. So I had to shoot the arrival to town for the end of episode 6, and I'm not sure it ended up that way in editing, where he gets off the train and it matches the pilot. And the director had this idea of doing a whole take where we just follow the back of Bernard's head with the focus just on Bernard's ear, and everything around him is in soft focus, which they didn't end up using much in the final cut, if any. But to do that, I had to put like the wide angle anamorphic lens, which is the 35, which is pretty wide angle, and then put a diopter filter on it, and then follow the focus on his ear. Except we're shooting film, there's no one looking through a viewfinder, so to even know what diopter to use, I had to have them rebuild the eyepiece onto the Steadicam, so I could put diopters in front of the anamorphic lens and line it up on the back of someone's head. Because tape measures don't work anymore with diopters, really. So it had to be eye focus. So I would essentially eye focus with the diopters to the viewfinder, then take the viewfinder off, convert it back to Steadicam mode, and then we'd be pulling focus by video tap after that. So that was one of those things where it's harder to do that sort of shot on film than it would be digital.
I was going to talk about another question about shooting on film, like how more difficult is it shooting a television show on film because of the faster pace? Or did you not find it too much, actually?
No, WestWorld it's funny, it's shot, it's very ambitious. So they shoot a lot of setups, a lot of cameras, everything's running all the time. So in the end, you feel like you're just shooting as much footage as you would on any show, because they just don't wait.
It must cost more. I mean, not many shows. I think it's the only show that shoots. It's the only show that shoots
we had
on
like
film.
7 bodies on our package with we had every HD tap that was ever made for an ARRICAM was on our show. So we had to have cameras with standard def taps, which created certain weird monitoring problems, or we'd have signal problems because the down converters would create weird issues with the signal freezing and things like that. But they work very fast and they get a lot of shots done. And it's just like doing like a Michael Bay film or something in terms of just the energy on the set. You just setup after setup after setup, and cameras are, third camera is always just thrown in, or they're grabbing stuff all the time. So you have to light for the wide essentially. And, it's a bit crazy, you know.
You said you got multiple cameras. I mean, how many? I mean, obviously the thing with the main difference I've been told, you know, between TV and features is obviously features you might have, you know, say 6 cameras on an action scene like car crashes and things like that, but most of the time, you know, you might be dealing with 1, 2, maybe 3, but on TV shows, you know, like you said, you might have, you know, 3 or 4 cameras. How do you sort of approach your lighting style, especially in like WestWorld where you're having to replicate other people's lighting styles?
Well, it's you know, whether you use multi-cameras or a single camera is really a stylistic thing, less about TV versus film. Because you know, I've been on films which are mostly single camera style and shows which are multi-camera styles, and then I flipped it. I've been on movies that are multi-camera, but the show is single camera. A lot of Marvellous Mrs Maisel is done with just one camera because we're moving all the time on a wide-angle lens, and there's just nowhere to hide a second camera, and we don't want like a long lens B camera kind of grab shot. You know, when we run multiple cameras on Maisel, it's to do cross coverage. Like when we're actually going to stop and talk, then a lot of the reasons she shoots the way she does is she wants to get the performances all in one take. Yeah. So even if we have a single camera shot, she'll sometimes tell me, look, can you put B camera in the kitchen? So when they leave the living room, B camera will pick them up and they'll keep acting in the kitchen, and they'll leave the kitchen and A camera will pick them up and they'll keep going to the bedroom. Yeah. And then, you know, sometimes we've got a third camera in the bedroom to pick them up when they're in the bedroom. And then they leave the bedroom and they're picked up on the A camera again. So the actors, for them, it's all one shot.
Yeah.
But there's cameras staged in different rooms. So it's a series of oneers, essentially single camera shots rather than multiple cameras shooting the same thing. Or we'll cross cover, you know, if they stop and talk and she says, I do want 2 singles or 2 overs, she'll ask me if they could be cross covers because she doesn't want to do all one performance and then redo it all for the other performance. Yeah. So that's, you know, that's always a lighting challenge. But you know, WestWorld is sort of an action show, and my show episode particularly had a lot of chaotic, you know, people breaking into the labs and running down hallways and attacking them. It was a kind of a war episode, you know. So definitely 3 cameras almost all the time on these scenes and stuff. And style, you know, the show style is moody and naturalistic, you know. Sometimes I get notes if I use too strong a backlight or something because they felt it was too stylized. They wanted it to be fairly, you know, naturalistic, just fluorescent lights in the labs and other things, but with mood and contrast. And so the real challenge was just how do you create mood and contrast when there's multiple cameras pointing everywhere? Because it's a side light. One camera is a front light for the other camera. So that was the bigger challenge, I think, there. Yeah.
Because I mean that's I think, you know, on a lot of these webinars and stuff that have been happening at the moment through the British Society of Cinematographers, you know, that's a question that has been asked a lot. You know, how are DPs coping, you know, with the faster pace that they're now expected to work? But not only that, but also having to light, you know, nicely, do a really nice job, you know, lighting. But then you still got 3 cameras or 4 cameras and stuff. You know, I mean, it's tricky. I find it tricky just sometimes with 2, you know, or cross shooting or whatever. How do you try and sort of?
You know, I've got Susie wears a hat all the time, and so she's always got this cap on, and Maisel, and so she's got to have light below her eyes to fill in her hat brim. But if I'm doing 360s or multiple cameras, how do I get a low light on her if I'm cross covering on the midge and you know, I'll do all sorts of things like I'll put a hot spotlight on the tabletop from a lamp. So just not because I want a hot table spot, because it bounces back into her hat brim. So
and I'm sure they have those issues with WestWorld. I mean, I think there's only Ed Harris who wears a hat throughout, but you can tell that they've, you know, brought, instead of the high sun, they brought something else down just so they can get it under that brim of the hat.
Yeah. What's kind of nice about Westerns, you find, though, is that the big hat brim, one is it, you know, allows you to shoot even in like a noon light. There's no light hitting their face. Yeah. And they tend to be lit by the ground a lot, you know, outdoors. If you're in full sun, there's a lot of bounce off the ground often up into their hat brims. So if you just overexpose the film a little bit, you often get enough detail. We actually do more negative fill on that show, where outside we'll bring in a bounce on one side and then bring a big solid on the opposite side, to create a little bit of contrast on the face. Otherwise it just gets a little too flat in the shadows. But yeah, usually you do something for the eyes and things. But
and I'm guessing that obviously, do you know why they wanted to shoot on film in the first place? I mean, obviously the highlights, there's a lot of outside work. The highlights are held very well with film.
Well, I think that's just Jonathan Nolan. Is Christopher Nolan's brother. And they've just both been very passionate supporters of film their whole career. Yeah. So they wanted to do it on film. They wanted to prove that it could be done on film. I think he had a series for network that was digital. I think when he went to HBO for WestWorld, he probably told them he wanted to do it on film. And HBO is one of the most film-friendly of all the cable shows. They still. I just saw that HBO Bad Education film with Hugh Jackman, and that was shot on film. So they seem supportive of people who want to shoot film.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah, I think all the DPs on WestWorld, we all talk about how the pluses and minuses of trying to do television on film, but we're all amazed at how flexible film is in terms of latitude.
Oh yeah, especially outside.
When you're shooting on a Western saloon set, and it's like, seems like it's 7 stops overexposed out those windows, and then you get dailies back and you still see the whole street traffic going out the window, and you're thinking like, I didn't even try to balance for that. It's there on the negative.
Yeah.
Just crazy how much overexposure latitude there is. Yeah. That aspect's fun. When I first came to WestWorld the first day to visit the set after I got hired, they were doing the Western Street set, and they had a camera reload, and they said, reload, and they're starting to reload mag, just as a horse-drawn train just went right by the camera, and this big cloud of dust rolls in as they're reloading the camera. Then they're blowing out the mags and blowing out and I'm thinking like, film, yeah, this is the dirtiest environment in the world to try to be working on with filming, but they managed to do it,
Do you think they could have got away with shooting digital and then just kind of put in a bit of grain and things like that, a bit of post magic, or do you think it's just those highlights that are kept so well when you're shooting in hard sunlight and you've got your darker interiors and things?
It's hard to say. I think with an Alexa they probably could have gotten pretty close, but I don't want to speak for them. They love the way film looks, So it's
fair enough. Yeah,
it's just I don't think I think this new season that I didn't work on, they did shoot a little bit of digital for some night exteriors, maybe in Shanghai or somewhere, but they had some, might have been downtown LA, but they had some very low light urban scenes that they needed to shoot available light in, and they did bring in a digital camera. Paul Cameron tested it, and I was able to show them, look, I can do these shots with a digital camera, just because in terms of the light levels. So but
in terms of the working on WestWorld and working on Mrs Maisel, I mean, they're obviously they're big shows, but they're quite different shows. Mrs Maisel is very family orientated, and it's a lot of moving camera, a lot of fast dialogue, with a fast comedy and everything else. And then you've got WestWorld, which is a bit of a slow burner. It's cutting backwards and forwards in timelines, and it's huge sets. It's quite a big show. So what's your preference? Like, do you like working on one over the other, or do you just like mixing it up a bit like we said earlier about features and TV shows?
I like variety. I think, what's nice about Maisel is just that I'm more in control over the image. When you do these kind of big action-y shows where they got multiple units going and things like that, you're all trying to match each other and contribute to the whole product,
can't
but
be
there's
too
less
down one
there's
line, I
less
guess.
ownership of the image. You know, you're not.
Yeah.
You know, you can say that sequence is mine or that scene is I'm really proud of, but the overall show really belongs to so many people
Yeah.
that it's you don't feel quite as emotionally tied to it. I think it'd be different perhaps if I'd done the pilot and done episodes over time rather than just coming in,
Sure.
you know, now and then or something like that. But you know, just show to show, it just varies. It's fun to come in, you know, with shows that have a strong style and just kind of do an episode though, because it's a good challenge and the show looks good and it's got good production designers and good crew people. And like I did one episode of Mad Men, and that was a lot of fun, just matching their style and trying to get their rules down about what sort of lens to use and what sort of lights to use and nail that. It was fun. Got to watch a lot of episodes of Mad Men and then come back to them. And it's the funny thing is when you study the show and then you go back, you have to be careful because sometimes you match stuff. It turns out that they never liked that much. Like they'll say, this episode where this, and, oh yeah, we don't do that anymore. Or the, you know, showrunner hated that, you know, or something like that. So you go, oh, so I guess I shouldn't copy that or something.
I've seen you done a few, you know, pilots for a lot of shows, and obviously Mrs Maisel and stuff. But in terms, you like you said, you've come in and say like episode 6 or episode 8 and done other series like Mad Men. But when you've done the pilot, do you just feel like, yeah, I've set that look? It was a really fun experience, but now I want to try something else. You know, whereas Mrs Maisel, you kind of stayed on. I was just wondering, like, your thought process behind that, and you know why you might not have carried on the series or anything like that.
Well, you know, some of the pilots I got offered the series, and some I didn't. Part of it is just that the pilot shot in one city and the series shot in another city, and you know they're looking for local people, you know, necessarily or something. It's hard to tell. Half the pilots, they love the pilot and they want the series to match the pilot, and the other time they have issues with the pilot and they want to make changes for the series. So sometimes they, you know, even though you could easily accommodate those changes, they sort of feel like, well, if we start from fresh with brand new people, you know. And the other thing is the pilots are almost like a little mini feature where it's really you and the director creating the look, just like a feature film. Yeah. But TV shows are really created and run by the showrunner, and sometimes when they go from pilot to series, that's their chance to sort of divest themselves of the control of the director of the pilot. You know, it's their chance to take ownership of the series now, and do the things they like and don't do the you know, avoid the things they didn't like about the pilot. Yeah. So they kind of feel like if they hire their people and start from scratch again, they can control what they always wanted the show to be after the pilot directors left or things. You know, and particularly, I think Designated Survivor went through. You know, the showrunners that I worked with on the pilot didn't even get past the first episode, and then within the first season, I think they went to 2 or 3 showrunners. So that show kept changing hats all the way through.
I mean, they have so many directors on these series, you know, that I watch and hear of and stuff, you know, and they're you know, you might get 4 or 5 4 or 5 directors. And then maybe 2 or 3 DPs, but I can imagine it's very difficult to, you know, to keep the consistency, and especially the love for it, you know, sometimes if you're on it consistently.
Yeah, I mean, it's some shows like Maisel, you know, 90% is directed by Amy and Dan, so it's really their show.
Consistency,
Directorial wise, last season they had I think one episode they didn't direct. Out of 8, they did 7. The season before, there were 3 they didn't direct out of 10. So they did 7 out of 10 they directed. In the first season, I think there were 2 they didn't direct. I'm not sure, but they do the bulk of their directing. So again, it's nice because the look and everything is all being controlled by the people whose show it is, and and then there are shows that hire, they call a supervising director, who does a bulk of the episode. So it has a kind of directorial consistency because half the episodes are directed by one person, who sort of comes in at some point, and that's nice too. It's I have been on some shows where, the problem is that I'm alternating with another DP, and the other DP is the one who gets the supervising director, and I get all the guest directors. And then you get notes about this episode doesn't match the look, or this shot didn't match, or this, they weren't happy with this. It's just like, look, it's because you've given me all the guest directors, and of course you're happy with the ones you directed, but and then so I feel sorry when it's flipped, and I'm the one that's working with the main director, and the other DP's getting all the guest directors, because I know they're going to get the same sort of notes come back to them, So it's sort of the politics of television,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think.
You have questions? No. No. Okay.
Yeah, I think we might as well sort of finish it on the final note, which is there any sort of tips or, I guess, recommendation reads or things people should look out for on set, or basically just any advice really you might give to sort of young and inspiring cinematographers out there? I know you said you're working on the latest ASC book manual, yeah. But I mean, is there anything out there that people should look out for, or that you can recommend, or do something to do in their career that might help? I don't know.
Well, career-wise, I'm not great at job advice, but I think it's important to maintain contacts that you make over the years, because one job usually comes from the last job you did, or the 3 jobs earlier, or something like that. So being in touch with people you've worked with or went to school with will just make you more open to getting that phone call, being available, even to help out here and there. Just like the WestWorld thing, the first season, they had another set of DPs come in, and that was a show that had a hiatus where they shot like half the season, then shut down for 5 months, and then kept writing, and then came back and finished the last 3 episodes. And they hired 2 new DPs to finish this first season, but then they had so much work to pick up that they hired me as a 3rd DP to do pickup work. And that was only supposed to be like a couple of days. It turned into a month, and then that turned into 5 months of work on the 2nd season. So again, it's just pure luck. I got the call because I knew both the DPs who were doing the end of the first season, and Jeff Juror recommended me, to come in and do pickup work. So it's good to stay in touch with people. And other than that, other than constantly studying and keeping up with the technology and stuff like that. I'm not sure about other advice. We were just talking about today on the internet, someone had said the best advice he ever heard was know when to shut up. And it's it reminded me of a similar thing that happened to me, where I love films, so I get very excited, talking about movies. And once I get thinking about how to do shots, if the director asks me, I'll come up with 10 ways to shoot a sequence. I'll say we could start outside the window and look at it from the outside looking in, or we could start here and come in and, And I remember working once with one director. We'd go scouting, and every location we'd come into, I'd start like throwing ideas out. And finally the director said, I need like 10 minutes to think through. You can, after that you can, and I just realized I had to learn to just not say anything. And the same thing happens with blocking, because I found when you're at a blocking rehearsal, you see all this stuff happen. It's going to be impossible to cover if they're going to do coverage, or bad for lighting, or create terrible amount of crossing the line issues. You think, wow, this sequence, they managed to cross the line 5 times. I'm going to have to cover every close-up twice and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And what I learned is that don't say anything, because often after the first blocking, when they do it a second time, it usually gets simpler. The actors tend to want to explore the space, so they'll stand up and they'll cross, and they'll go here and cross, and they'll do this. And then the second pass, they'll cut out half those crosses, because they're starting to find their performance. They don't feel they need much busy work. So if you say something too early, you're kind of jumping in. You're worrying about things that actually aren't going to be an issue, and you're getting involved too early. So I've learned to just wait out the whole process and see what the final blocking is going to be before I say, if now that it's simplified, if when you cross to here and if you didn't go all the way to the other side of the table, you would still be on this side of the line. But the moment you come around the table, you've crossed to the other shoulder of the other guy. And now we'll have to get into this discussion of which side of the line we cover back on the guide. We have two angles and all. So thus the actor say, oh, I don't need to go around the rest of the table, or you'll just move the prop over. If the phone, they're crossing to pick up the phone, you move the phone 3 feet closer to where you got to pick it up, and you suddenly you've saved an eye line cross. Things like that, So. But you try to not jump in too early, because some of those things sort themselves out, and you don't want to be known as the guy who says, no, you can't do that. You want to be an enabler. So trying not just biting your tongue and waiting until it's your turn to speak up is a good.
That's definitely sound advice.
Good advice.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for coming on.
Everyone watching has really appreciated all your wise words of wisdom and an insight into the shows you've worked on and features. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll see you all next time. Cheers.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.